April 16th, 1457 BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III led his powerful Egyptian forces down the city of Medigo to battle the rebellious coalition of the Canaanite vassal state, led by the king of Kadesh. The total kill count from both sides summed up to be around 12,000. There were 1,000 wounded and 3,400 of the Canaanites captured. This event became known as the Battle of Medido, the first ever recorded war. But this was far from the last. Man has been warring since the dawn of time. There have been many reasons that war has started and continued throughout time. The most common causes, but not limited to, are nationalism, imperialism, militarism, religion, greed, territorial, and economic gain. Countless lives have been lost and or taken due to these key factors. Countless years of history written in blood about these many battles. As time has gone, many different types of media have grown out of these wars. Books, songs, and movies, and even comics have been about war or war-related issues and stories. Some of these comics are made simply about the wars itself or about the people who fought in these wars. Others about those impacted by these wars. Some comics are made as propaganda to highlight the heroics of these personnel of these wars, while on the contrary, there's comics that show the explicit harshness of these battles. So in this video, I want to see how these wars affected the stories that have come out during and after certain wars, the genres and characters that came from these wars, as well as those who have written or worked on comics that have first-hand knowledge being impacted by these wars, and many more. Comic books as we know them now really took off in the late 1930s. Not long after, American comic book publishers began to include wartime or war-related stories in their line of comics. These publishers put their wartime stories in these popular anthology titles. Even before officially entering World War II, we got one of the most iconic comic book covers to date with Captain America #1, where we see Cap socking Hitler, which at the time was met with slight controversy. Later in 1941, we got the comic book Black Hawk from Quality Comics, which ran in the Military Comics Anthology, later known as Modern Comics Anthology. Black Hawks being about a fictional team of World War II fighter pilots. This comic was acquired by DC Comics once Quality Comics went under. The series ran all the way to the mid-1980s. It has been off and on in syndication since. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, war comics moved from these anthologies and started becoming their own standalone titles, especially during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. These comics really took off in the United States and Canada. Most of the titles focused on the American military stories, mainly at the time World War II comics. Many of these creators making these comics had a real direct line to that war, whether that they served in World War II or knew someone who had. These wars had a really huge influence on the comic industry at the time, and even to this day. Black Hawk at one point outsold all the other comics on the stands aside from Superman. The peak of these comics were from the 1950s to the 1980s. In the war comics genre inception, most of the stories in those comics were fictional. They depicted the great American hero stopping the invader and saving the day. I call these fictionalized war comics. DC Comics was a big player here in producing fictionalized war comics, dropping titles like Our Army at War, All American Men of War, Our Fighting Forces, and Star Spangled War stories. Over at Charlton Comics, we had a whole lineup including Fighting Army and Fighting Marines. Quality Comics launched GI Combat, and of course, Marvel has Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. Later on, we would get war comics that were way more far-fetched, but based in a war setting or war atmosphere. As I mentioned before, we got Captain America, who fought in World War I. Iron Man's origins started with him being a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Tony Stark was a war merchant making weapons for the United States military. One of my favorite fictionalized war comics is A Bloody Mess, and my personal canon origin story of a classic character, Punisher Born. Punisher Born is a 4-issue limited miniseries from writer Garth Ennis and artist Derek Robertson, the same team that brought you the series The Boys. Born is one of the many origin stories of the Punisher. The comic centers around Frank Castle's time serving as a Marine in Vietnam, 1971. The story is told through the POV of a young Marine, Stevie Goodwin, who is in his last days of his deployment, steadily counting the days till he returns home. Castle is a captain of this platoon filled with drug addicts and alcoholics. Goodwin wishes to live long enough to make it back home safely and sees his best option of that happening is by sticking next to Frank Castle because he is great in combat and has elite level survival skills. In this 4-issue miniseries, we really get a good and grimy look at who Frank Castle is, having this demonic voice in his head goading him into being more and more violent. Castle, unlike everyone else, finds the war zone of Nam as a place where he can be free to be his true bloodthirsty self. We also get to see how everyone else views Castle and the war environment. Castle still holds on to this anti-hero authoritarian persona, not just killing the enemies he is at war with, but even those who are his fellow Marines. For example, Corporal McDonald is stopped by Frank from raping a Vietnam female enemy. After this, Corporal McDonald goes to the nearby river to freshen up. Frank secretly follows McDonald down and drowns him in the river while McDonald is washing his face. Stevie Goodwin sees the whole thing but doesn't say nothing. Not all of Castle's killings of his own Marines are justified, like with the McDonald case. Castle tricks a visiting general, General Patton, to walking in the line of fire of a sniper because he threatens to close down the base Castle was at. So much more happens in this comic. I highly recommend checking it out. This comic is a great example of how to expound upon an already well-defined character. Punisher Born is still a work of fiction in the grand scheme of things in the war comics genre, and there's nothing really wrong with this comic or any comic of the fictional war genre that came before it, even if many of the elements of these war comics are either embellished or omitted altogether to make war look more egregious or not bad at all. They still bring awareness at the very least to what war is or was about. As these over-the-top fictionalized iterations of wartime comics were being published and gaining popularity, one comic publisher known for pushing boundaries, especially back in those days, against things like the comic book code authority, began publishing their more grounded and realistic take on war comics. This publisher was EC Comics. In the early 1950s, EC Comics released Frontline Combat and Two Fisted Tales, both led by editor Harvey Kurtzman. You may know Kurtzman as the man who started Mad Magazine. These comics weren't your typical glorified battle stories. They showed war as it really was, gritty, brutal, and tragic, working with artists like Jack Davis, John Servin, and Wallace Wood. Kurtzman and these artists really brought life to these comics. So many stories came out of these two anthologies. One of my favorites is a story about what your character is in the face of hardship. This story asks, when you're faced with a life or death situation, are you about self-preservation or standing in line with your fellow soldiers? Prisoners of War. Prisoners of War was printed in 1950, issue 3 of Frontline Combat. This story, written and drawn by Kurtzman, follows a group of GIs who have been captured by North Korean soldiers. Through this comic, we see these POWs march for weeks on end through North Korea, getting little to no rest, having to take turns carrying their wounded comrades, and even having to deal with one of their own, a soldier named Benedict, as he tries to kiss up to their captors in order to get more leniency as they walk, becoming a kiss ass and a brown noser, telling his own people what to do and telling on them if they do not listen. It's pretty sick. The narrator of this comic states that it's spots like this that brings the best and the worst in people. The worst is what we see from Benedict. After weeks of marching, these POWs and their captors are seen by the U.S. Air Force fighter jets. These jets start blasting and bombing the group of men, not knowing who is friend or foe due to being too far out. Our narrator uses this commotion as a way to run away, effectively escaping with a few of his buddies and being saved by the United Nations forces. The POWs and the Korean soldiers who survived the Air Force attack made it to their destination, and the remaining POWs who didn't escape were killed, including Benedict, shot by the exact Korean soldier who he was trying to kiss up to. These EC combat stories are short and sweet with a lot of impact, really grounded. Though they are fiction, they seem to be stories of things that may or could happen in action. There isn't a one-man army mowing down 50 of his enemies by himself like at the end of Punisher Born, but a more realistic tale, like how hard it is for those soldiers to walk for miles and miles for weeks nonstop. I can't relate to the Punisher comic, but I can relate to walking long distances on low energy. EC Comics wasn't the only publisher to make a grounded war comic. Marvel published a groundbreaking project similar in style and theme as this EC short story, with the war-based series titled The Nam. The Nam comic originally followed the story of fictional soldier Private First Class Edward Marks, though it occasionally shifted focus to other characters as he navigated real historical events from the Vietnam War. Each issue was set 1 month after the last, portraying events that took place roughly 2 decades before the publication date. Some issues highlighted major events like the 1968 Tet Offense, while others focused on more intimate scenes such as interactions among soldiers, encounters with Vietnam civilians, or relationships with loved ones back in the United States. While some narratives reflect classic war comic themes like confrontations with harsh officers or depictions of combat, others capture uniquely Vietnam era experiences such as the emotional toil faced by soldiers returning home to public hostilities. The comic was written by Doug Murray, initially drawn by Michael Golden, who drew the first 11 issues, followed up by Wayne Vincent. The original editor was Larry Hama, then later on Don Daly. The comic was met with tons of critical praise. When the first issue dropped, it outsold X-Men. Doug Murray and Larry Hama both served in the military respectively. All the war comics I've talked about so far have been from the perspective of the United States soldier, mainly fictional people fighting in either real-life battles or made-up ones. But what about the stories of those who really were in these wars? The stories of those who were affected by these real-life battles? What about the comics that show us the viewpoint from the person holding the weapon against us? Why are they stepping in the line of battle? Are their perspectives any more different than our own? Maybe they're just doing what they're told is best for their country. The Other Side. The Other Side is a 2006 Vietnam-themed 5-issue miniseries written by Jason Aaron and drawn by Cameron Stewart. Jason is a pretty prominent comic book writer. He has written so many comics for Marvel, DC, and some indie publishers. He wrote one of my favorite runs of Thor, where he introduced Gorg the God Butcher, who himself was butchered in the Thor Love and Thunder film. Such a waste of a brilliant character. Anyways, this comic shows the duality of fighting wars from both sides, with our two main characters, a Marine named PFC Bill Everett, who gets drafted to Nam right after graduating high school, and our other main character being a North Vietnamese soldier, Vo Binh Dai. We follow them as they both fight for their country, how they both at first seem to feel like they're doing what is right. Then we see as they both experience the horrors of this war and start losing faith in what they're really fighting for. The war wears upon both their souls and sanity. This comic is great because it really shows the power of nationalism and patriotism. No matter how many times you are told that doing something evil is right and just, in your heart, it's still evil. Also, the choice to show the perspective of the quote-unquote enemy or the realities of these Vietnam soldiers was brilliant on Aaron's part as well. This comic was pretty personal to Aaron because it's based off of his cousin's time in Nam. His cousin being Gustav Hasford being a Vietnam vet and the author of the semi-autobiographical novel The Short Timers. This book was what Stanley Kubrick used as his basis for the movie Full Metal Jacket. Artist Cameron Stewart was pretty dedicated to this project as well, even going as far as taking a trip to Vietnam to prepare to draw this comic. So that was pretty dope on his part. What about those who aren't soldiers fighting the good fight on the front lines? The people who are affected by the implications of these wars in a bigger ways than many could ever think of. Barefoot Gen. Barefoot Gen is a semi-autobiographical manga series by Kenji Nakazawa based on his own experiences as a survivor of Hiroshima atomic bombing during World War II. The story follows Gen Nakakoa, a boy living in Hiroshima with his family. Set in Hiroshima in 1945, Barefoot Gen begins just before the atomic bomb is dropped. Gen's family is poor but loving, and his father is critical of Japan's militarism, which brings hardship to the family. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing most of Gen's family and destroying the city. Gen survives and witnesses the horrifying aftermath: widespread destruction, suffering, radiation sickness, and death. As he struggles to survive in a devastated world, he tries to maintain his humanity and helps others, especially his mother and newborn sister. This manga is a powerful anti-war and anti-nuclear statement, highlighting the brutal realities of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Barefoot Gen was also adapted into 2 different animes. In a similar theme to Barefoot Gen comes Graveyard of the Fireflies, which also depicts the horrid aftermath of the dropping of the A-bomb. Both of these stories are powerful and really, really sad. I couldn't even get through the graveyard of fireflies. Also, that one scene in Jin is pretty much all you need to see if you want to get a powerful animated depiction of war. It's crazy. Interesting enough, World War II had a major influence on the creation and evolution of manga in Japan. The war disrupted the country culturally, politically, and economically, and those effects deeply shaped post-war manga in several key ways. During World War II, manga and other medium were used by the Japanese government as propaganda tools to promote nationalism and military ideas. Manga artists were often limited in what they could create, with strict censorship controlling content. America did the same thing with some of their comics and cartoons at the time as well, and low-key still do this today. After Japan's defeat, the American occupation brought greater freedom of expression and an influx of Western culture, including American comics and cartoons like Disney. There are many stories of these American soldiers who would leave their comics around for the local kids to pick up and read. This led to new styles and storytelling techniques being adopted by these Japanese artists, especially the idea of entertainment over propaganda. Osamu Tezuka, who grew up during the war, was deeply influenced by both the trauma of the conflict and American animation. After the war, he helped create modern manga as we know it, using cinematic techniques, complex characters, and emotional depth, creating mega popular characters like Astro Boy. Tezuka being named the godfather of manga. As Japan recovered economically, manga became a mass entertainment medium, expanding to genres for all ages, supported by earlier post-war cultural shifts. Now it's become more popular than the medium it has taken influence from. One can also argue that Akira, another widely popular manga, is also a commentary on the rebuilding of Japan after World War II, but that's a topic for another video, which at this time I am sorely underqualified to talk about since I've only seen the Akira anime and I couldn't get past chapter 1 of the manga. One day I'll finish the series. I am a huge Otomo fan though, so don't get me wrong, it's just I haven't really taken the time out to read the manga. But yeah, now let me fly. In 27 years of life, there have been few times when I've experienced art that has connected me off first listen, reading, or viewing. Like, you know, that feeling of love at first sight, but with a piece of media. I've had this feeling when I first listened to Denzel Curry's Nostalgia 64, Max O'Cream's 187, and Tyler the Creator's Bastard. Some movies and shows like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, and the most recently, the film Sinners. Such a great fucking movie. Such a great movie. When reading Now Let Me Fly, I got this same feeling of, oh man, I cannot put this book down. The first time I read it, I'm pretty sure I finished it in maybe 3 hours or so. I binge read that whole entire book. Now Let Me Fly is a comic about the life of Eugene Bowler, about his amazing journey from being a lowly, helpless child in the Jim Crow South to becoming anything he wanted, from being a race jockey, a pro boxer, to becoming the first African-American military fighter pilot in World War I, fighting for France. The comic was written by Ronald Wimberly, who is one of my favorite comic creators out now, not just for his amazing writing skills, but he is also a master cartoonist as well. The comic is illustrated by Barham Ravel, who did a fantastic job on his art duties, I must say. This comic really does a great job of breaking down who Eugene was, bringing a very interesting man who seems to be erased or forgotten by historians to life. Though a good portion of this book has war in it, I wouldn't say that this is a straight up war comic. It is much more than that. Wimberly's storytelling and pacing is great. I love the fact that he didn't hyper focus on the war aspects, but when he did talk about the war aspects, Wimberly kept it real and grounded. Revel matches Wimberly's energy with the artwork he put in this comic. He hits all the dramatic beats perfectly. This comic centers around Eugene, who at the time is an elevator operator at the 30 Rock building in New York. Eugene and the TV executive get stuck in an elevator. While stuck, a conversation of Eugene's life comes up when the TV executive sees one of Eugene's World War I medals. My favorite part of this comic is when, after Eugene finishes telling this man about the torment he and his family went through in the South, telling the man about how the KKK broke into his childhood home trying to find and hang his dad. After this flashback scene, we go back to the men trapped in the elevator where the TV executive says, "What they do down there in the South is barbaric. No wonder you had to escape." And Eugene replies with, "Yes, indeed, but at least in the South, the snake has a rattle." Like, what? I couldn't put the comic down after I read that line. This is why it is important for Black writers to write these type of stories about prominent, amazing Black persons and people in history, especially those who are forgotten about. This comic and the ones I mentioned before are important parts of the war comic genre because they give a real and unique viewpoint of war and the realities it comes with while still being entertained. Some of those comics really pull on your heartstrings and really make you think about things in a different way. The genre of comics has evolved so much, and the war comic, as I've shown, has grown and branched off into so many different directions, from the straight up heroic fictional tales, realistic fiction, to real life war horror stories. The most recent comic genre that's benefited from these wars breaking out is comic book journalism. Comics journalism is a form of journalism that covers news and nonfiction events using the framework of comics, a combination of words and drawn images. Typically, sources are actual people featured in each story, and word balloons are actual quotes. The term comic book journalism was coined by one of his notable practitioners, Joe Sacco. Sacco is probably one of the most important cartoonists to come out of the 21st century. Unless you're really tapped into comics outside of the buff dudes in spandex, you may or may not know who he is. Joe Sacco is a award-winning cartoonist who is known as the first cartoonist to practice rigorous investigative journalism in the comic book form. This isn't the same as a political cartoonist where the cartoonist takes a more satirical or short quippy stance on a political issue in a very small but slightly, depending on your sense of humor, funny way. Sacco has worked on many different comics and stories. His most popular and well-known comic is Palestine. This comic covers Sacco's time and experiences while in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Boy, I'll tell you, this comic, it was a really tough one to read. Much like Barefoot Gen, this comic showed you the real and raw realities of war and political conflicts. This comic was a look into what Palestinians have gone through and continue to go through while living in this occupied land. Sacco essentially represents the listening reader as we listen to the stories from the people of Palestine. He gives us a look at these people's daily realities and struggles. Throughout the comic, we see Joe's character start off as someone there to listen and learn about the happenings of these people to someone who can't help but be affected by all the things that are going on. Sacco really lays it out there in a powerful way. He also shows that even though there are horrible times that these people of Palestine go through, they are still people who get married, have kids, parties, and such. This comic came out in 1996, then was collected into a full graphic novel in 2001. Now, with the recent current events going on at the time of this recording with the Gaza Strip, it has recently sold out. People just like myself ran to buy this book to get a better understanding of what's going on out there. Recently, Joe put out a book, sort of a pseudo follow-up comic to Palestine titled War on Gaza, which is a collection of published comics Sacco did for the Comics Journal's website, calling out former President Joe Biden and his participation of what Israel is doing on the Gaza Strip. Kind of sad that this comic exists. Another comic similar to this that I've read is Kent State by John Backdurf, professionally known as Durf Backdurf. Kent State is a graphic novel about the Kent State shooting in 1970. The Kent State shooting, or the Kent State massacre, were the killings of 4 and wounding of 9 unarmed college students by the Ohio National Guard at the Kent State University campus. The Ohio State National Guard was called down to the campus to handle some students who were protesting the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam and the U.S. draft. Jerf, who is an Ohio native, did a huge amount of research making this comic, piecing and gathering as much evidence as he could to recount the last days of those 4 students leading up to them being gunned down. It's a really heavy and depth-filled comic. Jerf is one of my personal favorite cartoonists. I would highly recommend any of his comics, which for the most part are pretty heavily researched. Both Durf and Sacco's types of comics are very important because they inform people in real time with real facts of what is going on with the topic at hand. No embellishment or fiction, just fact. There's a reason so many people went out to buy Joe's comics. Sadly, it seems that man has not evolved out of going to war among itself, but what has evolved is people's perspectives on these wars and conflicts. This evolution has trickled its way into comics, and we've seen this from the heroic tellings of man saving the day to those who aren't even sure what they're fighting for. These comics I've mentioned really made powerful statements about the states of war and how different each story can be about one overarching topic. We can read these types of comics and laugh, cry, feel powerful, or ashamed. But this is why comics are my favorite storytelling medium, and it is so much bigger than men in tights and capes.
So, war in comics, this was a subject that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. I am a huge fan of like the war comic genre. I think it's just super fantastic and interesting. I also think that it's a genre that's super underplayed in the grand scheme of comic books. I feel like people always talk about capes and tights and superheroes, but nobody ever talks about like the more nuanced and niche subgenres that come within comics, especially like war comics and slice of life comics, those type of comics that are really more like hard hitting and a lot more grounded and I think are more relatable. Like if those comics were the ones that were pushed more into the mainstream, I feel like it'd be a more respected medium as a whole. I mean, I don't want to go down like a huge rant about like mainstream comics and stuff like that, because there's so many videos out there that talk about and those type of things of what the comic industry could do better and yada yada yada. And I don't want to be, have a whole yap session about it, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I think. It's whatever people are buying, and people are still buying, Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman over and over and over. But, I just want to highlight some of these creators that are, making these really, really great comics, like a Durf, like a Jason Aaron, a Joe Sacco, and, these guys who really put in the work to make really exquisite stories and really, high emotion, high stakes, and, things like that. Yeah, I don't know. So appreciate you for watching this video. Also, I am a comic book creator. I have a bunch of new comics and old comics up on my website that you can pay for physical copies. I also have a few digital copies on my website you can download for free. One of my older comics I have for download, and I also now condensed all of my comics that I have now on a big sampler. So instead of like downloading multiple copies of a comic, you can just download the one big sampler, and it has all of my comics on there, like previews and stuff like that. So go check that out. I also started a Pateron. So on this Patreon, I'm going to have exclusive behind the scenes content. I'm going to start rolling out videos that are kind of like my tips and tricks on how to build up a YouTube channel. And then once I'm done with those videos, I'm going to do videos about how to self-publish your own comics and stuff like that. Like my way of doing things, going from writing a script all the way to getting the book printed and to your front door. So go sign up for that if you want to get that exclusive content. I'm also thinking about other ideas to do on the Patreon, things like comic book reviews, either reviewing mainstream books or like books that come out that week, or even requests from fans or people who want to get their books looked at. So I'm thinking, about those ideas. And if you have any ideas of what I could put on the Patreon that you would like to see, go comment below. And also go check out my Patreon. Even if you can't pay for it, just, subscribe for free. I'm going to be putting out free content on there as well. But yeah, appreciate you guys for watching the video to the end. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.